Hey guys, Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. I have a real special treat for you guys today. We're going to be covering some of the medieval Eastern Orthodox polemics, and joining me, I'm super excited, is Allan Ruhl. I'm sure Allan probably doesn't need to be introduced to most of you guys that would be watching my channels, but if you don't know, he's got his own YouTube channel. We'll be linking that in the description below. Really recommend you guys take the time to go watch some of his videos. I've been following Allan for some time now, and he's just a wealth of information about the medieval church. I learned quite a little bit about the Crusades. You thought you know it all till you hang out with Allan for a little while and hear what he has to say. And interestingly, unique, I think, among some of the people, those of us that are interested in medieval studies, Allan is quite adept at the Byzantine Church in the Middle Ages, and I would say probably the Byzantine Empire as well. So, Allan, man, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Brian.
So, I guess to get us started, I was going to ask, in your opinion, if you and I were to be transported back to the year 1054, let's just say right on the other side of the mutual excommunications that were meted out, and we're looking at the now schismatic church of Patriarch Michael Carolarius. Do you, in your opinion, Allan, do you think that the church that he was representing on that day is the same Eastern Orthodox church that you would come into contact with today?
Well, I mean, in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. I mean, because, like, of course, you have the apostolic succession. They're the succession from that church. So in that way, it's the same. But in terms of belief, especially belief toward the Catholic or the Latins, um, the the polemics are off, and I think that's what you primarily wanted to discuss. The
Mm-hmm.
polemics. Like if you were to ask, like say in 2024, if we're talking to an Eastern Orthodox Christian, probably about 80% of the people that we see online will say, um, yeah, it's like the biggest difference is the Pope. The Pope's the biggest difference. And you know, if you go back to 1054, that was not the issue at all. It's not like the Pope was trying to like claim anything that he hadn't claimed before. In fact, if you take a look, I might read an excerpt from Metropolitan Hilarion Alfiev. Um, I'll just he's got a letter. I'll get to this a bit later on, but he talks about the letter, and he noticed something is like something is and this is a letter from Cerularius to the Patriarch of Antioch trying to justify his excommunication of the Latins. And he brings up a whole lot of things. Front and center is the unleavened bread in the Eucharist. Catholics use unleavened bread, and that's the same to this day, both in
Mm-hmm.
if you go to a Novus Ordo or a traditional Latin Mass, it's still the wafer of unleavened bread. That's of course transubstantiated. Uh, and he talks about this epistle, and he says, in this epistle, Cerularius makes no mention of the main reason for the division, namely papal primacy. You can find this on page 115 of Orthodox Christianity, History and Canonical Structure of the Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Hilarion Alfiev, who's currently alive today. He's a contemporary guy. In fact, he'll probably be the next patriarch when Kirill dies. He might. There's a few other candidates, but he's a big name in the Russian church, and he's published a lot of books. He's kind of like I guess I could compare him to someone like Cardinal Ratzinger at the time. He's
Mm-hmm.
a high-ranking guy. He's an intellectual. He's
He's well respected.
yeah, he's well respected. He's fairly conservative on all things, and so his opinion holds some sway. And he's a good writer too. I've got like about 4 or 5 of his books, and they're all pretty good. Um, and so he's noticing. He's like, wait a minute, where's the Pope in all this? You know, the Pope is what, in fact, people like Jay Dyer will call Catholics papists,
Hmm.
which is kind of funny because that's a Protestant slur. It's not
Yeah.
an Orthodox slur. You know, um, in 1054, uh, obviously there's no mention of the Pope. There is. It's all about the azymes, what's called the unleavened bread. That's the Greek word for unleavened bread, azymes. And yeah, I could get into the sources if you want, but this was either the number one issue. Shortly after this, you have the Filioque joining it as the key issues.
Hmm.
And those would be the 2 key issues, at least until the Council of Florence and the fall of Constantinople. And I think after that it changes a bit. But
Yeah, and that's actually, the reason I was asking. I want to kind of to get your thoughts on this. I want to go to kind of jump into some of these the polemics, and I was thinking kind of the impetus for my having this discussion. I recently had run. I hadn't seen it in a while, but you might be familiar with it. Speaking of Ratzinger, uh, I believe it's when he was Pope Benedict XVI. He made a statement that we basically the two churches can't hold each other to anything that wasn't held in the first millennium. And I don't know if you've heard that before, but it seems many of the Eastern Orthodox interlocutors take this to mean that they only have to concede what they believe the first millennium church to have been, which they assume, they don't prove. And then the other thing is, uh, if I can make sense of this, it's like, okay, we're holding each other to this first millennium metric. Well, what were the complaints? Like, what were the grievances of the Eastern Church at that time? Not so much today, because, like you were just mentioning, if you look at it today, so much of it's shifted in content and even in interpretation in some ways, especially with regards to the Filioque. And this is why I think going back
yeah,
to some of these grievances, it's so important because if we're going to hold each other to this sort of Benedictine metric of what was going on around the time, at least by the time of the schism, I think that we have to seriously consider the arguments that they were making then. Because in many ways, Alan, and I don't know your thoughts on this, I don't find in the history of the Orthodox polemics a resolution to these controversies. It was almost as if they just sort of quietly tucked them away, and like we just like they never conceded, but they don't like how often when you engage in Orthodox today are you going to argue about enzymes?
zero,
Right.
zero. That's how much you're gonna see for things like you brought up the Filioque. That's been a long-standing objection.
Mhm.
And as you pointed out, although it's kind of like the Big Bang theory. The Big Bang theory has been the standard cosmological model for the last 70, 80 years, right? But
Mhm.
the Big Bang theory has changed dramatically. They've added spatial curvature. They've added dark matter, dark energy. The brand name, the Big Bang is still there, but it's changed drastically, and it's frankly it needs to be discarded as a theory. But that's kind of like what happened to the Filioque, because the Filioque, if you go back to you compare Photius versus Blackernay, it's a completely different set of arguments. Some overlap, but uh, a lot of it is quite different. And frankly, whether it's Photius or Blackernay, there's nothing good there. Now, in terms of the azymes, that's one thing that's kind of forgotten, and I think a lot of I think a lot of people, if you ask them personally, like if you ask Jay Dyer, sitting down with a cup of coffee off the record, he won't think azymes is a huge thing. He won't. Of course, if I bring this up to him publicly, he'll have to stand his ground. Oh, of course, it's heretical. Ha ha ha. But if you like for example, I think Jay Dyer on his channel. He's got the 10 reasons I'm not Roman Catholic. Uh, Take a guess how much that has to do with the Azymes.
Probably doesn't make the cut, I would imagine.
None.
Yeah.
Nothing about Azymes. You know, he'll talk about the papacy. He'll talk about clown masses. He'll talk about uh, the papacy. He'll talk about, you know, the Catholic Church being used, hijacked for globalists. He'll bring up everything except the one thing that was the big issue at 1054, which was the Azymes. And the fact that it's not brought up anymore, pretty much on an unofficial or official capacity, shows that we've won. We won.
Well, and that's what I want to. So maybe just to get into it a little bit for people that aren't as familiar with what we're talking about. You know, one, how high up on the priorities would you place the enzymes issue for the Orthodox in 1054, thus about, and also what are they kind of getting at here with this? Just on a,
Okay.
even on a superficial level, like what are they concerned about?
You know, it's hard to tell what they're concerned about. So in 1054, the primary thing was the unleavened bread and other liturgical practices like fasting on Saturday, the bishops cutting their beard. I'm not kidding, by the way. There's a book by Sichensky about this, and I want to buy it, but it's too expensive. It's like
His books are
one.
ridiculously expensive.
Yeah, for his his first two books, I managed to catch it on Amazon one day. It was like a third of the price. I'm like, buy, you know, and then it jumps back up the next day. I'm like, oh man. In terms of the one with the Azymes, I haven't seen that one. And to be honest, I'm not going to spend it because I don't think he's a great scholar. He's an okay scholar.
Mhm.
But I think he's often overhyped. I think his Filioque book is the better of the two books, although that book is flawed as well. Again, he's okay. I'm not going to say he's terrible, but he's certainly not the guy I'm going to spend over $100 on a book on, Canadian or American.
Well, and so then, what is the level of priority would they place this argument at this time?
Okay, in 1054, it was number one.
Mm.
Now, I think over the next 100 years, the Filioque surpasses it as number one, and it gets the Azymes get promoted to number two. But I think that those two issues. So at 1054, it's Azymes. Sometime in the next 50 years, the Filioque jumps over that. And by the time, and I think so, from about 1100 to Florence, it's Filioque and Azymes, and then some things below that. Let me share something.
Sure.
I don't have the book. I can't find the book available, but it's the PDF. It's called the Decline and Fall of Byzantium to the Ottoman Turks. It's by the 15th century Greek historian Tukos. And this is what he says when the bishops arrive at Constantinople from Florence. So Florence is over. They arrived, and the people of Constantinople come to greet them. They're like, how did we do? All right, I'll read this. As soon as the hierarchs disembarked from the triremes, the Constantinopolitans, as was customary, embraced them and inquired, how are you? What news do you bring us of the synod? Have we perchance gained the victory? They replied, we have betrayed our faith. We have exchanged piety for impiety. We have renounced the pure sacrifice and have become Azymites. And then they talk a bit more, but they're like, oh no, we become Azymites. So even in the 1400s, the Azymes are front and center of everything. It's one of the most things. And Brian, I'm going to quiz you here. What were the four big things um, that the Union of Florence, the document of Florence covered.
I let's see, it would have been at the Filioque way,
Yeah.
fires of purgatory.
Yes.
I think it would have been they were arguing the papacy by that point, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Yeah.
And then what am I forgetting? You're gonna have to fill me the last one. I'm drawing a
And
blank.
Azymes.
Azymes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I
So
mean,
it would. So even by Florence, you're saying it's still.
it's still
And,
front and center,
yeah. Right.
and pretty much if you study Florence, it's a more important issue than the papacy. The papacy was an important issue, obviously.
Yeah.
Purgatory was important, um, but I don't know how it's a big deal then because purgatory was talked about long before that time.
Hmm.
But you saw the reaction, according to my Greek source, uh, Ducas, that the bishops are like, we become Azymites.
Yeah, and
It's not
that's
like we they didn't say we became papist
yep.
or filioquist or whatever. It says we become Azymites.
And that was actually I had that in my notes to bring up to you because that is a more recent polemics in terms of those titles, the filioquist. If you call us that, if you call us the papist, you're really just borrowing from the reformers at that point.
Yeah,
But in terms of
especially the English.
yeah, but in terms of the Azymites, that is what they would traditionally would have been and I think that's something, Alan. I don't know if enough Catholics out there that are involved in this conversation with Orthodox, like really kind of like let the significance of that sit in, because the other context of this period, 1054, which is sort of something I'm really interested in. You're right you're like on the verge of the Gregorian reforms. You're certainly within the Cluniac reforms and the elevation of the papacy. You've got the papacy of Pope St. Leo the Ninth at this point. So you're certainly within the Cluniac reforming period. You're coming into the Gregorian reforms. Where is these polemics against the papacy? It's almost like the silence speaks for itself.
Well, and I just want to bring up one other thing. You talked about Cluniac reforms, we're on the bridge of the 11th century, often called Gregorian reforms. I don't much like that word because it implies Pope Gregory did all of it, where there was like half a dozen
Mhm.
popes involved. Either way, um, you know the reforms I talk about. According to Craig Trulia, who's written a book, I don't have the physical copy. I got the PDF on my computer. He and of course on his YouTube channel as well, he's blamed papal supremacy and infallibility on Anastasius the librarian, who was a 9th century fellow. I won't get into that, but the point is that's long before. I mean, if Craig's right,
Mhm.
that's long before 1054, and yeah, no, that was not an issue then, because I mean, the Orthodox accept, because I think by the time you get to the 7th century, the arguments for the papacy are so good. Like I'm not saying it's bad prior to then, but by the time you get to the 7th century, it's really hard to argue against it when you have Pope Gregory the Great, Pope Martin. There's that one quote that people try to abuse of Pope Martin, but I've got a video where I just blow that out. The power was lacking. I got a video where I just blow that out of the water. Uh, Pope Agatho, John of Philadelphia, Stephen of Dore, Maximus the Confessor. It's just east and west. The papacy was firmly believed in. Now, and I think that's the reason it was not believed in 11, because in 1054, the center of the political world, where was the okay, today the Catholic Church is in Rome, Italy. In Rome, Italy, it's headquartered at the Vatican. But that's not the most powerful country, most powerful Catholic country. There are more powerful Catholic countries, certainly Christian, but let's stick with Catholic. You might go to Brazil, you might go to, like, I think even in Europe, you have some countries like Poland's kind of emerging as kind of like the
Mhm.
superpower of Europe now. Um, but but the point is that's not where it's theologically headquartered. In about the year 1000, and certainly by 1054, the Byzantine Empire was the political center of the Christian world. Yes, the first see is in Rome, but the political center of the Christian world is Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. That changed by the end of the 11th century. By 1054, it's still true. Because if you take a look, you can find online a map in 1025 of how big the Byzantine Empire was. It's huge. They actually had recaptured Antioch at that time. At that point, Antioch was part of the Byzantine Empire. Things started to change in 1071 when the Turks conquered Anatolia, or almost all of Anatolia, and then you had the Normans stealing their land in the Mediterranean in Sicily and in Durazzo in that area. Then they're shrunk to a very small empire. They're no longer the political powerhouse they used to be. Hence why they need to appeal to uh, Rome for the Crusades. That would have been unthinkable in 1000 and even in 1054. So I think they had an attitude about them like, all right, we're number one. So we don't care what you think. I think it inflated their egos a bit. Um, and so they didn't care what the papacy said, but they had to care when you have your emperor appealing to the papacy for help against the Turks. That would happen, Council of Clermont in the First Crusade.
Yeah, and it's unique, I think, with the political considerations as well. I think in some ways, and I'm like by no means an expert in this, but I think in some ways their theologians at this point are reading back, and I'm still talking in 1054, are reading back into the history because they are politically and theologically in conflict with the Armenians at this point. And the Armenians, in their minds, are representative of the Monophysites, who they themselves are using, at least in the Armenian Church, are using this enzymes in their Eucharistic liturgies. And so I think it's a little bit of a conflation going on. I'm not quite for sure about that, Alan. I don't know if you have any insights into that.
Yeah, no, the Armenians use unleavened bread. As far as I know, they still do. In fact, I
Yeah.
think they do. Sure, I've seen services on YouTube of theirs where they have the unleavened bread. And they and I think I saw an interview with Sieczynski once. Um, why why was that the big deal? Why was that the big deal? Why was the beards the big deal? Why was stuff like that? Because that's things. Of course, people from the West are going to Constantinople all the time. It's like New York. Lots of people go to New York, right? Even if you're from nowhere near. Like I've been to New York. I live in like New York, London, Paris. These are global cities. A lot of people travel to. Constantinople was that of the ancient world, or in this case, the medieval world. And of course, priests are going to be there too. And you would see the priests. You got the Orthodox priest with the big beard. You got the clean shaven Catholic priest. If you go into a Catholic mass, you can see the bread. It looks very different. It's a very obvious change. You see the communion. It's way
Mhm.
different than how they do it. So I think that's one of the reasons why it became that way. It's because you can see it with the naked eye. That critique can apply to like a peasant can understand that critique. You can tell a peasant in Byzantium, okay, go the Orthodox Church, go the Latin Church. You can see the difference, right? You don't need to be a scholastic to see that kind of difference. And of course, yeah, it is a difference. But I mean, I have never seen. I could be wrong, but I don't recall any canon law in the first millennium that says it has to be leavened bread. I don't think there is. Um,
I do know with some of the other lists, they are quick to, and by that I mean the Byzantine lists, which are these like sort of stylistic lists that the Greek church were making for a series of centuries, I believe. And their grievances towards the Latins, they would basically like, yeah, it's directly related to what Allan is saying here, because their lists are not lists that are written for like academic Byzantine theologians. They're basically written like very bullet point without a lot of explanation. And so much as they do give explanations to justify some of the things, they're very quick from what I've seen. And mainly what I've read from this is from the book by Tia Kolbaba, her book called The Byzantine Lists. And when they can appeal to a canon, I believe they are very quick to appeal to a canon.
Well, yeah, and like I don't think there's any canon based on unleavened bread. Now, most of the polemicists, I think, will acknowledge that by the time of 1054, unleavened bread had been used for about 200 years, which is shocking because Photius, he critiques the Catholics for a lot of things, but he doesn't bring up unleavened bread. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of interesting, and it would have been known at his point. I'm not saying Photius is a great theologian or polemicist or anything. I don't have a very high opinion of him,
Neither do I.
but yeah. So I mean, the fact that he didn't bring it up, though, it shows that I don't know. I kind of noticed this um thing in the Byzantine Church uh around the time of the schism. It's like you have to do things our way. You have to now, of course, the Catholic Church believes that you have to believe the same thing
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. Now, the liturgy could be different. The local customs could be a bit different. How you worship's a bit different. The prayers you use are a bit different, although a lot of the prayers would be in common, like the Our Father, since it's from Scripture. But that's what I would say is that uh, it kind of became. I don't know where this attitude came from, but it's our way or the highway,
Mm-hmm.
and that had not come from anywhere. In fact, the Catholics weren't arguing that you have to use unleavened bread. No, it's just that that's the way we do things here. Please respect it. That's what we were
Mm-hmm.
saying. In fact, in Rome, there were Greek monasteries in Rome. There, the Grotta Ferrata monastery is a Greek monastery in Rome that's always been communion with the Catholic Church. Always been in communion, and they always use unleavened bread, and no one cares, right? Because that's how that rite works, right? Um,
I think this
so
is close. I was going to say, I think this is very closely related to the issue with the, which you had brought it up, the shaved priests, because you often, at the time, it's not as high on the list as some of these others, but it's still a fairly common critique. And there's claims of, Latin priests being, androgynous, wanting to be like women. And it's really what it comes down to is a Roman versus Greek custom, cultural expression, because it's not uncommon, even going all the way back to Julius Caesar, right? It became common for in the Roman world, um, by the actual city of Rome, for the Roman world, shaved was the cultural expression for men of like honor and prestige. It was seen as more refined, but that's known to change too because Marcus Aurelius was said to have a beard. Also, on the Greeks, it's not completely uniform because my understanding, Alexander the Great shaved and he made his men shave. So, and then in the Roman world, being shaved was a sign of stoic wisdom, and having a beard was a sign of being barbaric. So fast forward several centuries, and these Christians in the East are just highly concerned by the fact that these Latin priests shave. It really, in my mind, it almost seems to be just a sort of schismatic mentality. Like we are going to try to find the reason to schism. I mean, I've got a quote here from one of the Eastern Orthodox saints, quoting Nicodemus the Hagiorite. He says, quote, "The innovation of shaving the beard ensued in the Roman Church a little before Leo the Ninth." This is where he places it. Gregory the Seventh even restored to force in order to make bishops and clerics shave off their beard. Oh, and what a most ugly and disgusting sight it is to see the successor of St. Peter close shaven, as the Greek says, like a fine bridegroom, with this difference, however, that he wears a stole and a pallium and sits in the chief seat among a large number of other men, like him, in a council called the College of Cardinals, while he himself is styled the Pope. Yet bearded popes did not become extinct after the insane Gregory, a witness to this fact being Pope Gelasius growing a beard, as it is stated in his biography. Where, end quote. Whereas, if you go back to Pope Gregory the Great, which is clearly before Pope Leo the Ninth, and Nicodemus, he's writing, so he's lived 1749 to 1809, just to give you guys the idea where he's writing from. He says it begins with Pope Leo the Ninth, which would be around 10. He's trying to place it as a time of the schism. But Pope Gregory the Great says, quote, "What is signified by the hair that was shorn but the sublimity of the sacraments? What by the head but a high priesthood? Hence too it is said to the prophet Ezekiel, And thou, son of man, take thee a sharp knife, take thee a barber's razor, and cause it to pass upon thy head and upon thy beard. Clearly that by thy prophet the act of judgment of the Redeemer might be set out, in that he can clean away from his Jewish priesthood the sacraments of his commandments, and shaved the beard, and that forsaking the kingdom of Israel, he cut off the glory of its excellence. What do we understand in a moral sense by hair, but that by the wandering thoughts of the mind, the shaving of the head, then, is the cutting off of all superfluous thoughts from the mind, and he who shaveth falls upon the earth, and he who, restraining his thoughts of self-presumption, humbly acknowledges how weak he is within himself." So that's just kind of my illustration there of this was not a new 11th century innovation, as far as I can tell. I mean, the custom of the Roman shaving seems to have some pretty good precedence in the Western Church by the time of the schism.
Yeah, and let's be honest, it's a nothing issue. What does this have to do with theology?
Really?
I mean, you can at least argue the Filioque, and even the Azymes to a certain extent are theologically relevant. But the thing with the beards, it's just so petty. Like, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
can I read the letter? I've talked about this letter, but can I read the letter that Cerularius sends to the Patriarch of Antioch after the kerfuffle with Cardinal Humbert?
I think that's great. It's a wonderful illustration of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's about 3/4 of a page, so it'll take about 2 minutes to read. Okay. They do the following according to Jewish practice. So pause for a sec. He's essentially accusing them of converting to Judaism because they use the unleavened bread. That's what they eat in the Passover. Mm-hmm. Fasting on Saturday, that's the Jewish Shabbat, so they see the Jews and they're trying to connect the Romans to the Jews. But I'll read. They do the following according to Jewish practice. The use of unleavened bread is in itself an error. So is the fact that they eat things strangled, that they shave, that they observe Saturdays, that they eat unclean things, that their monks eat meat and pig fat, and I don't know how that's Jewish if you eat pig fat, and the entire skin up to the meat, that they eat cheese during the first week of the fast and meat fair week, that they eat meat on Wednesdays, cheese and eggs on Fridays, and on Saturday fast the entire day. In addition to these violations, they have introduced an addition to the holy symbol based on malicious and dangerous reasoning, which runs thus: in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Close quote. And at the beginning of the divine sacrament, they pronounce, one is holy, one is Lord, Jesus, to the glory of God the Father, through the Holy Spirit. Moreover, they forbid the marriage of priests. In other words, they do not allow those with wives to the priestly rank, instead ordaining celibate men and cousins are allowed to marry each other. And during communion at the liturgy, one of the celebrants kisses the others while eating unleavened bread. And the bishops wear rings on their hands since they have supposedly taken their church as wife, and so it is said wear engagement rings. And heading out into battle, they besmirch their hands with blood, inciting souls against themselves and being themselves incited, as some have assured us when performing holy baptism. They baptize through one immersion, calling on the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, filling the mouth of the baptized with salt. Dot dot dot. There's an ellipses there, and they do not venerate the relics of the saints, and some of them even the holy icons. And they have not canonized alongside the other saints our holy and great fathers, teachers, and hierarchs, namely Gregory the theologian, Basil the Great, and the divine Chrysostom, and even completely reject their teaching. Instead, they have added some others who can hardly be joined to the choirs of the saints, even partly. So, you see that critique. Who who makes that critique today? Who makes that critique? I mean, if you go to Jay Dyer's channel, he's yapping about the essence energy distinction, right? Where is that in there? The essence energy distinction, believe it or not, is a 20th century critique. It's not even brought up in the 1848 encyclical of the 19th century, signed by 4 patriarchs and 29 metropolitan bishops. It gives numerous complaints, far more than the stuff, but it's nowhere to be found, the essence energy distinction, you know. Now, some people will say that's pre-Aquinas, but by the time you get to the Council of Florence, Aquinas and Palamas are long gone. Their theology is vindicated in the area. But what are the number one things? Filioque, azymes, and by this time, purgatory and the papacy. Although, let's be honest, I think most people will concede that purgatory was in the pre-schism Western Church. If you watch Father Josiah Trenum's his video on Roman Catholicism, he talks about purgatory being in the pre-schism church. He's like, well, it got more popular after the schism. Well, I don't know, but
yeah, and I don't find the critique that these were, okay, so the Roman Church develops after the schism, so now we're addressing these later developments. But that's still sort of like evades the point that these issues that were the issues in 1054 moving forward weren't really resolved. Like, it's not like you like solved the enzyme issue and now we're moving on to 14th century polemics against the Latin Church. It's as if we sort of like quietly suppress these arguments and now we're going to go over, like, moving the goalpost on us a little bit, which is a very frustrating thing at times for anybody that's ever dealt with Eastern Orthodox.
Well, for the Filioque, they move the goalpost left, right, and center. Like they keep the issue the Filioque. It's like the analogy I made with the Big Bang. The Big Bang is there. They're just changing it constantly. Whereas, like I was having a discussion with I don't know if you know of some very very low polemic quality of polemic guy, Patriarch Prime. He's like, oh, the Latin Filioque was good before 1054, but they changed it after 1054, just before, specifically just before the Council of Lyons, and then it had to be refuted at Blackernay. And I'm like, all right, then what was Photius complaining about? I mean, if things only changed around the time of Lyons, that's long before the that's long before Photius was long before that, hundreds of years. And then it's like, well, it was floating around, and then you just hear the cope come off the rail.
Yeah, and the other thing I've heard too is that, well, okay, you're just going to look at Carolarius's his list of grievances, and yeah, they're maybe they're a little ridiculous, but look at Cardinal Humbert's list, and I don't know necessarily of any particular scholars in this area that would come to necessarily to the defense of Humbert and Olive, because he clearly had a few things that were his mismanagement of some of the grievances I think are glaring. But the thing I would say about that is I don't see where the Latin Church necessarily ran with Cardinal Humbert's list of grievances. And the Latin Church, in many ways, sort of went off into its own thing. And occasionally we would be, Council of Lyons, Council of Florence, we would address these things again. Whereas, as far as Kolbaba's work is concerned, Michael Carolarius really ignites kind of a long-standing tradition of these lists of grievances that last for hundreds of years in the Byzantine Church. She lists from John of Claudiopolis, someone named Siedes, someone named Stilbes. There's a list called the Opusculum contra Francos. Like there's a series of these lists that are born, and they all sort of turn to Carolarius as um, the precedence for what they're doing.
Well, I think that's interesting. If you taught the Eastern Orthodox today, not just the online polemicists, but the more academic, the scholars, the monks, Cerularius is not really regarded as in high regard. Like he's not one of the pillars of orthodoxy. He's uh kind of uh like I don't know when they started talking about the pillars of orthodoxy. I think it's a modern thing in the last 100 years. But he's not a pillar of orthodoxy. That's Photius, Mark of Ephesus, and Polemus. Whereas I think Cerularius, the only reason he's respected at all is because he's the guy in 1054.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's the only reason, because I think most people will acknowledge he's a very unsavory guy. Like I believe the emperor had him removed as patriarch not long after the 1054 on completely other issues.
Mm-hmm.
The guy sounded genuinely insufferable, you know.
Yeah, but it's interesting too, though, that he did manage to sort of kick off this trend, and not all of the lists are identical, but they're fairly consistent if you see sort of the things that they're, and some of them are head scratchers, like when you read about the Latins. There's several critiques that we give insufficient reverence to Our Lady. So, and like that's clearly an odd one, and then also
Yeah.
that we don't venerate relics and icons. It's like where, and so this is actually something I wanted to bring up to you. Do you think that there is a distinction as late as 1054? I know earlier in the dialogues the Greeks would have made this distinction, but later by 1054 in post schism, are they still making a distinction between contra Romana and contra Francos, or are they like conflating everything at this point? Like, do they see? And I know like the Western Church and the Frank, but there's not like a 1-to-1. There's so many times where the papacy is kind of slapping the wrist of the Frankish church. Maybe not as much as they are so much the Greeks, but it seems like the Greeks conflate often at this point.
I think by 1054 that polemic had fallen by the wayside. I think that was
Mhm.
more of like a Photius type
Mhm.
thing. Um,
And Romanides jumps all over it, in the 20th century. He thinks that is the impetus for the later schism, so it's an interesting. Uh,
yeah, well, Romani, like it's kind of been resurrected. Like this was not like, yeah, it's used in Photius, but from 1054 to Florence, or in fact, I think to the 19th century, that argument's fallen by the wayside. It's been revived uh, by some people who, because it's not like it's kind of immature to say the West was completely kosher up to 1054 and then they just went off the rails. No, it's so that they have to say things were brewing, things were
Hmm.
being put in place. And who is that? They'll point to the Franks and say the Franks were wrong on X, Y, and Z. But the problem is, if you point everywhere else, those things were going on everywhere else too. They were going on in England. They were going on in Germany. Well, I guess Franks were in Germany, but Spain and
Hmm.
Italy, they were happening everywhere. Um, so I mean, yeah, they'll pick on the Franks, but the truth is that pretty much everyone at the time of the 8th and 9th century believed what the Franks did, which is the pretty much entire Western Church. So
Yeah, and the Franks, I know the Franks bucked a little bit around Nicaea too, per the veneration of images. But again, what was the council that they held? The little synod
Frankfurt,
that,
Frankfurt,
yeah, and the papacy rejected it.
yeah.
So it's not like the Franks were just kind of given carte blanche control over the Western Church. There were things, there was things that were sort of received over time, and I think the Filioque. Theologically, I feel like the Filioque has been kind of like beaten into the ground, but I don't think there's actually been enough emphasis on the historical developments of the Filioque and how it was received across Western Europe. There's a lot more I think that could be said about that hasn't really been touched upon so much in some of the dialogues that I've seen.
I think something that someone needs to do and is to take all the polemics starting with Photius against the Filioque and map how the polemics have changed. Because if you
Hmm.
go to um, if you heard of this book,
Which is that?
Anselm of Havelberg, the Antisimonon, it's a dialogue between Anselm, a German bishop, and the Archbishop of Nicomedia in the Byzantine Empire
Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah, I've
in
heard of
the
that.
12th century. So it's about 1150 or so during the
Hmm.
Crusades, and like they have a cordial dialogue discussing issues, the three main issues, which were at that time the papacy had become an issue, but the biggest things were the Filioque and the Azymes. The
Hmm.
papacy was kind of a distant third compared to those two. And I've got my theory for that, but um, it is kind of forgot the point I was trying to make. What were we
You
talking
were
about?
you were saying there needs to be a
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, because when they discuss the Filioque here, it's interesting because it's post-Photian arguments. It's post-Photian, but it's not quite Council of Lyons or Council of Blacarne yet.
Mhm.
So you can see it growing steadily, and I think it's a good because I think this takes place like Odious is about 890, so about 150 years. So it's kind of like the halfway point almost.
Mhm.
Uh, between well, not quite the halfway point, a bit over halfway, but it just shows that how it's evolving. It didn't come out of nowhere, and these arguments aren't as sophisticated as um, Blacarne. Like I don't. They haven't invented the eternal manifestation yet.
Mhm.
That's just a huge cope that they had to do because they realized their arguments weren't working, so they had to move the goalposts and invent these new arguments that no one else had used.
Yeah, I really recommend that people take the time, if you're interested in this, spend some time with John Beckos. And there's been some translations within the last few years of his works into English that are well worth the time if you're interested, sort of, in the development of the Filioque discussion. I think he sort of, um, I still think Beckos is very relevant to the conversation to this day.
Yeah, of course, the modern kind of ecumenistic people who write crap like the Chiadi document and all that stuff
Hmm.
will just say just dismiss him out of hand. But I don't think that's because he's a voice from that period. He was
Hmm.
because I don't know if you know what was going on at that time in the patriarchate. There was an internal schism inside the Patriarchate of Constantinople, there were three branches: the Josephites, the Arsenites, and the Unionists. The two groups, the two ones, Joseph and Arsenites, had their own issue. I won't bother getting into what that was because it's nothing to do with our thing. And of course, you have the Unionists. Now, both the Josephites and Arsenites were anti-unionist. Like they had their issues with each other, but they were both anti-unionist. And basically, as soon as Emperor Michael VIII dies, his son Andronicus takes over, who's firmly anti-union. So he just says, "Bye-bye, John Beckos. Let's get Joseph back."
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph annuls the union. Ironically, Joseph had been put in by Michael VIII because Arsenius didn't do what he wanted. Because this gets into why there's the Josephites and the Arsenites. But so at this time, you have John Beckos, and he writes. I've not ever read his writing. I probably should read it. Is it available on Amazon?
Beckos, I know there was. Have you ever heard of a unionist initiative?
Oh yeah.
I believe he has I don't know if he's translated himself or he's just posted it. I think he's got like a blog somewhere. And I think he was the one. And then I think there is someone. I can't think of the fella's name, but I think there is actually a compilation of his works that you can buy on Amazon.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because that would be interesting to just see how their arguments are changing. And I think by the time you get to Blacarne, that's pretty much the arguments they use to this day. Like they don't use Photius anymore because his stuff is frankly really bad. I mean Blacarne's bad too, but Photius is really bad. I mean, have you ever read his the Mystagogy of the Holy Spirit?
I started to, and I knew going in because I had taken a class, and I knew going in where his errors were in terms of how he was interpreting what the West meant by the Filioque. So it was sort of a non-starter for me. I didn't like follow through with it.
Yeah, and
I wasn't impressed with him.
Yeah, and it's kind of like an angry rant. Like it's like a teenage girl on her period. It's just
and also just knowing the situation around why he's like the situation with the papacy with Nicholas I and what happened around all of that. Like it just kind of and I get who was it Dvorak that sort of kind of revisited Photius as reconciled to the church at the end. I'm not going to argue that, but there's just
he
something
died inside the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
he did.
But there's just something that like kind of leaves a bitter taste about the whole Photian schism, like, and maybe that's just me being like a biased Latin or whatever. But like I think even objectively, I would kind of come down on the side of Nicholas over the issue as it sort of unfolds.
For sure.
Yeah.
Photius is a. You know when Photius was canonized?
No, I don't.
In the 1800s.
That makes sense.
That's amazing because post because I believe in the Byzantine Empire, based on a biography of Ignatius I had read. Ignatius was the one he was quarreling with.
Mm-hmm.
That they had a lost my train of thought again. Oh, I believe that post-Photian schism there was a strand of Byzantine theology that was anti-Photian inside the Byzantine Empire, let alone the Catholic Church, right? I believe there's a strand, and I think he was adopted as kind of a hero because in the 19th century, there was a lot of Catholic missionary work amongst the Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
And so to counter that, they had to bring up heroes, and it's like who are the heroes? Oh, Photius, he was one of the guys.
Yeah, you really do seem to, and this would be like a whole can of worms, but you really do seem to find an identity crisis in Orthodoxy around the 19th, 20th century, where I can see that that neo-patristic synthesis, as it's known as, with those Parisian Orthodox thinkers in the wake of the exile from Russia. I can see where they're trying to fill. I see what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to give an identity to the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, because it's kept having to reinvent itself. I mean,
Yeah.
it used to be. I mean, traditionally they were Caesaro-Papists. You know, you had the emperor as the head of the church. He would decide the doctrine. I have several examples of that from primary sources that I've never heard an Orthodox even try to refute.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the head of their church, and they believed it was impossible to have a church without the emperor. I have quotes from patriarchs on that. Then in Russia, it's a bit different. In Russia, they kind of thought themselves the third Rome because Constantinople had apostatized and
Mm-hmm.
gone over to the Latins. And then in the early 18th century, you have Tsar Peter abolishing the patriarch, and organizing a synod led by a procurator, a layman that he appointed. And
Mm-hmm.
I think I've always like to ask Orthodox people is during that 200 years where the patriarch was abolished and it was run by a layman, was that Orthodox? Was it Orthodox? Because as soon as King Henry VIII said, "I'm the head of the Church of England, and you got to submit to me," and all the bishops but one submitted, not Catholic
That's
anymore.
that's it. Yeah.
He kept everything else. He kept the Mass. He kept prayers for the dead. He kept the Mass in Latin even. He kept celebrate priests. He kept purgatory. He kept everything except the Pope. And once that happened, it's no longer Catholic. I'm sorry, but for the church in Russia, when they now keep in mind that it's not the church's fault that this happened. It's not the church's fault that the Tsar did this. No more than it was the Catholic's fault that King Henry VIII usurped the church. Um, and so like I'm asking them, I'm like, uh, was it still Orthodox in those 200 years? Because the patriarchate wouldn't get restored till the early 20th century, and so it's essentially been a tool of the state, whether that's a Byzantine, Russian, Turkish. It's been essentially a tool of the state, and it completely changed their ecclesiology in Russia. And if someone says it ceased to be Orthodox, my question is, well, how about all those saints then? Because they have a lot of saints during that 200 years. Saint Philard of Moscow, Saint Ignatius Abrakanov, Saint Seraphim of Sarov,
Yeah.
one of the most popular Orthodox saints in history. Um, so I mean, where's that? I mean, it seems to be. So the question is, did it cease to be Orthodox? So I think what I'm saying is kind of piggybacking on what you're saying. They have to keep reinventing themselves because the church that supposedly doesn't change. If you've started reading, they've changed throughout, and usually it hasn't been their fault. It's been because of the government, but it's still been changed. They've
Mm-hmm.
changed the doctrines. They changed the exegesis on John 14:28. My Father is greater than I.
Mm-hmm.
That you had the emperor bind them to a heretical interpretation under penalty of excommunication and death. So I mean, um, and yeah, so it's
And you see that, Alan, right on up into the modern world, because you also have the I probably get my Ukrainian pronunciation wrong here, but the Lviv Sobor, which was a Communist Party led synod,
yep,
which placed the Ukrainian church under the Patriarch of Moscow,
yeah, it had all been
basically
suppressed.
with guns at their back. And while the Soviet Union has dissolved and there's this like reorganization in Russia, there's been no repudiation of that synod coming from the Moscow Patriarch, right? So obviously, to me, that's a recognition of the sort of Caesaro, because I mean, the Russian Orthodox will always, and granted, there were many people that were slaughtered under the communists, Christian, Russian Orthodox in very high numbers. They were certainly persecuted, but at the same time, they worked with the government.
Oh yeah, they did. In Romania too, they did something similar. A couple years after that, they they I think it was 1948 or 49. They had kind of a synod of Lviv where the communists are like, all right, now the Romanian Catholic Church is now part of our communist state government run quote unquote Orthodox Church.
Mm.
Um, and so and like this 1940s, this is in the lifetime of people alive today,
Yeah.
and it just shows how the government has run there, and that's why I'm scared about this war in Ukraine. If Russia wins, like I'm not saying the Ukrainians are completely innocent, they've done some bad things too, uh, but I'm half Ukrainian, so that just shows what side I'm on. But from a Catholic point of view, if Russia annexes all of Ukraine, they're going to destroy the Catholic Church there.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always felt, as far as the political side of the Ukraine and the Russian conflict goes, I'm a bit neutral. But in terms of the ramifications of what would happen, my sympathies do lie with the Ukrainians who, under persecution many times over, have held to the union that they made with us in what, the 17th century or the.
Yeah, I think it's the late 1500s, 1596 or something,
Mhm.
Union of Brest, and then
Yeah.
there's Romania had a second union,
Mhm.
a separate union. It was not under Brest; it had its own Union of Uzhgorod or something. I'm not an expert on that, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but still, they were Transylvania was all Uniat, and it got absorbed, and all their assets stolen by the state, like the apostate communists.
Well, the only other thing I had from the lists, and it'd probably be too much of a can of worms, is, and I think it's actually even in the Carolarius list that you just had there, is the issue of baptism. And that's one, if you think these things are kind of irrelevant, that's actually one that's still very relevant. They haven't quite. It's something to consider, right? The Orthodox Church here, 1,000 years later, has not resolved the issue of the Catholic baptism, and I've been told many times over by well-meaning Orthodox apologists that it's no big deal, don't worry about it.
No,
But
it's a
to me,
big deal.
that's a little bit of gaslighting, right? To me, it actually is kind of a big deal that they haven't resolved the issue of our baptisms. Uh,
Yeah, and if you go on 1 Peter 5, I write an article about what year and Catholic baptisms were accepted or rejected completely independent in Constantinople and Moscow. They have two completely different set of, and it varies from time to time. Sometimes the Russians accepted ours, sometimes they rejected it. Sometimes in Constantinople they accepted it, sometimes they rejected it. And not in perfect sync, in completely different pattern. And believe it or not, a good book about this is the Orthodox Church by Callistus Ware. Like
yeah,
he
yeah.
breaks it down in this period and that period for what reason. It there's no that they don't know what a valid baptism is, and that's why you have people like Father Peter Heers who are trying to just say, okay, let's just baptize everyone. Just trying to, because he knows deep down that there's a problem. I mean, of course,
I think that's a more consistent position, honestly.
yeah, but I mean,
It's
I think,
incorrect. It's incorrect, but I think his
yeah, you realize,
intention is, yeah.
yeah, he sees the problem. He sees the problem that we see,
Mhm.
but instead of saying, "Hey, this is a false church. Let's become Catholic," he has this fantasy, but trying to fix it up. But there are Eastern Orthodox saints who were accepted by chrismation,
Mhm.
like Saint Elizabeth, the New Martyr uh, of Russia, who was, I believe, the sister of the one who got married to the Tsar. I don't know.
Mhm.
But she was accepted by Chrismation when she converted from Lutheranism. And keep in mind, the Lutherans have the same baptism as Catholics do.
Yep.
The 3 times pouring on the head. So I mean, there's no contiguity to this, and it gets even worse with sacraments, because in the 18th and 19th century, to do with ordination, because ordination's the same thing. They don't know. Some Catholic priests who convert are ordained, some aren't. They're just vested, but that's not ordination. There are entire regions, like we talked about Ukraine. We talked about Romania. We talked about, and we could also talk about Belarus and Hungary and places that were entirely uniat for hundreds of years. So Catholic uniats doing ordinations, placing upon hands. The lines of true ordinations from an Orthodox perspective would long be dead. And when these churches were forced to go back under the Russian church, when the Russians expanded and took it over from the Polish, um, they didn't send out a bunch of bishops to reconsecrate the bishops, reordain the priests, rebaptize the laity. No, they just kept it as it is. All right, you don't say the Pope now, you say the patriarch's or the procurator's name or whatever in the liturgy. So in entire regions of the Orthodox world, they would have a fake priesthood, a non-ordained priesthood, kind of like an Anglican priesthood. If
Well, that's
theology is true, and that's why we don't have to worry about any of that,
yeah.
because if you're in a false church like the Orthodox Church, you have to worry about that stuff, because they had no consistent theology, and to be honest, it didn't matter because they weren't doing that kind of missionary work anyway. But now, in when you point out these historical problems, it's impossible to find an answer. Like if Father Peter hears his theology is true, there is no priesthood in large regions of the Eastern Orthodox world.
Well, Allan, is there any we covered a lot of ground today. Is there any kind of overarching, like, if you just want to like leave people with what we've discussed about any final points you'd like to make about the conversation?
Yes, I do. The fact that in 1054 the number one issue was the azymes, and the Catholic Church has never changed on that. Never. If you go to a Roman Rite Mass today, Latin or Novus Ordo, it's still the unleavened bread. And the fact that it's not brought up anymore means we won.
Yeah.
We conceded, we won. And
Or if we didn't win and it's still a problem, then I expect to see a flurry of enzyme debates in the next few months and years.
You got that new convert, Luigi, debating the papacy. He debated sola scriptura with a Protestant. Luigi, start debating the azymes now, like your old school patriarch Cerularius.
Right.
Azymes.
All right, Allan, I appreciate you coming on, man. We should do this again soon.
We should, and if you want, you can come on my channel.
I'd love to, man. And everybody, take care. I will see you all soon. God bless.
God bless.